right, so Public Service and Public Policy Week. The public service you should all be intimately aware of, because we are all kind of part of the public service. You guys maybe not quite, but I definitely am. So today we're going to talk about two things: the public service and the and how public policy is made. This is our agenda for the day. Lots to get through, so let's get going. So we're going to start off with what is a bureaucracy. Too often we, throw that term around. We say something's too bureaucratic, and we might not actually know what we are talking about when we say bureaucracy. So I'm going to send you to a video from Crash Course, which is one of my favorite learning tools on YouTube. So note that it is an American video. So essentially, when the presenter says Congress, think Parliament. When they talk about separation of powers, think that remember that we have a fused legislative and executive branches, plus a judiciary. And when they talk about the state, obviously we're talking about provinces in Canada. So pause this video and go take a look at this kind of bureaucracy basics. Welcome back. So as we learned, bureaucracy is kind of the basics of government administration. So it's the non-elected officials that are running the show. In Canada, we tend to call our bureaucracy the public service. So what does our public service look like? So here's the hierarchy of a public service. So every department, so think Department of National Defense or Department of Transportation, has a minister. So they are an elected official who is chosen for the cabinet by the prime minister and sworn into the cabinet. So they're one of the key advisors on a specific portfolio, be that defense or transportation or indigenous services or anything like that. Now, underneath the minister is the deputy minister. The deputy minister is not elected. They are a career public servant who then manages the ministry on behalf of the minister. And there might be boards, crown corporations, other agencies and offices then underneath the deputy minister. So here's an example, and we're going to go through this in greater detail in class when we talk about Canadian Forces accountability and how you are related to the public service. But essentially, we have kind of a unique system in the Department of National Defense because we have this Deputy Minister of National Defense, but then we also have the Chief of the Defense Staff, all underneath the Minister of National Defense. So we're going to talk about that more, but that's just a little taste of how a government department looks, how the one that you're probably going to be most familiar with looks. All right, so I'm going to go through now a brief history of the public service in Canada. It's more interesting than it sounds. And just to get a sense of how the public service has changed over time, how its role has been conceptualized, how different prime ministers have related to the public service, and how much power it has had. So the first stage that we talk about is the crony era. So we call that pre-1930s. It was a pretty low-profile government and low-technology bureaucracy. And so really what just happened was you'd put your best friends in the public service as a means of patronage. So as a means to kind of give a job to somebody who maybe supported you. And so this is before we got the type of professionalization of the public service that we're used to today, that you could, get a job for your buddy just by putting them into the public service. But that was seen as okay at the time because government was doing a lot less, to be quite honest. And it was a lot smaller, and so it could function in this sort of more informal way. Then we move into the 30s, and we get what we call the golden age of the mandarins. So mandarins, that term comes from the Chinese exams for the public service. So the idea that there would be these really rigorous tests and exams for you to be able to get into the public service. So rather than patronage, we're going to put you in there because you have specific skills that you've demonstrated through tests. So that's where this idea of the mandarins comes from. So in this era, we see the public service providing expertise and technocratic knowledge, and really just having so much knowledge and power that ministers actually were somewhat held captive by the civil service, in the sense that the ministers would come and go, but the civil service had the knowledge and control. So Donald Savoy, who wrote a number of books about the public service in Canada, most of them are actually quite similar, but you can take a look at them. And essentially, he explains this is the era of the bargain. So the idea is that the mandarins, or the public service, is going to stay nonpartisan. We're going to keep our job between different governments coming and going. That was kind of the bargain. The government said, okay, you can stay put, you can stay in your departments, you can have a long-standing career, but in exchange, you need to stay nonpartisan. So you can't be supporting one specific government. So in the 1930s, there's such an expansion of programs that there really was this need to increase the experience and expertise of the public service, and that is what we call the golden age of the mandarins. Then Trudeau comes to power, Trudeau Sr., Pierre Elliott Trudeau. We see what is called the rise of the manager. So the idea that the public service was should have less of a role in creating policy, and instead it should be these elected ministers that are really at the head of the department, and that the bureaucrat is just managing all of the ministers' decisions. And so it's this beginning of this era of mistrust of the bureaucracy. Maybe they gotten a little too much power in this golden age of the mandarins, and Trudeau's really interested in having more centralized prime minister's office and more centralized power, and so we see that some of the public services power, therefore, it decreases. So then you get the 1980s, you get the Mulroney years, this mistrust of departments, this being skeptical about whether they're nonpartisan or not, really increases, and Mulroney even strengthens even more his hold on the bureaucracy. We also see in this era the era of new public management. So new public management means a more business-like, customer service-oriented public service. So if it works for business, then it should work for the public service too. It's really seen as the modernization of the bureaucracy. Then you move into the Chrétien era. And again, even more power in the center, so increased influence of the Prime Minister's office. And senior officials are really there to navigate the policy process, to network, to manage things, to make things happen, but not necessarily to make the decisions. So that's kind of like a very short history of the public service in Canada, from the age of just patronage appointments through an increase in prime ministerial power, and then this question of what exactly are ministers' role in policy making. So that's one of the key questions that scholarly literature has talked about is, who's really in charge? Is it the minister, or is it the deputy minister, or the public service? And we might say, well, in the first era, so pre-1985 or during the age of the mandarins, we'd say that, the ministers were kind of held captive by the public service, that civil servants were making the policy rather than elected officials. They had a monopoly on the information, which gave them a monopoly on influence. And really that elected officials didn't necessarily know how to handle the system. And so civil servants really took the reign. And senior bureaucrats had their own opinions and agendas. And when a new minister would come in, this new minister could be really vulnerable to this. It was at the point where civil servants could sometimes even go straight to the prime minister, as opposed to going through the minister. And when that started happening, things started to change a bit. And so then we see kind of 1990s to the present that ministers kind of are increasing their power over the civil service, but possibly just because the prime minister is increasing their power. So it seems 1990s to present that public service is a little less assertive, and that the influence of the prime minister, even on their own cabinet, means that the prime minister is really where the central power is located rather than in the civil service. So based on what we just discussed, why would this comic be funny and or poignant? Let's have a think. So we see Looks like Stephen Harper is coming to his office, and he's got hit up against a brick wall, the Ottawa bureaucracy. So this could be because Stephen Harper was seen to have a less than amicable relationship with the public service, and that the bureaucracy could really have that power because they have a monopoly of information, because they've been in the position for a lot longer, that they could, stall the prime minister or cause some roadblocks, even though the prime minister is the elected official. So that's where this comic comes out of and why it's so funny. So if that's the case, then how is the public service held accountable? So the first way is through deputy ministers. So the deputy minister, through the deputy minister, the bureaucracy answers to the minister and subsequently then to the prime minister. So deputy ministers can be required to appear before standing committees on behalf of their ministers. They can be required to answer questions at these standing committees about the goals, the outcomes, the resource use. Standing committees, of course, are committees of parliament. So elected officials can ask of deputy ministers what's going on. They have to be very careful, though, that they don't cross the line in engaging in political debates. The other way is through ministerial responsibility. So all civil servants are accountable for what they do, but the minister takes the responsibility of all that work in their department. So the minister has to be able to stand up in the House and tell members of Parliament and the public what's going on in their departments and take care of problems even if they arise. And in some cases, if there's a serious problem, the minister may even have to resign, even if they didn't actually do or cause the problem. It's kind of this idea that, the buck stops there, that they're responsible for everything that goes on in their department. Of course, the opposition sometimes takes things a little too far, asking for resignations for even the smallest little thing. But this idea of ministerial responsibility is really that ministers are responsible for what goes on. There's some critics of that, the idea that it's not really appropriate to hold ministers accountable for departments when civil servants may have committed the errors. But at the end of the day, the minister is the elected individual who can be punished at the polls based on their choices and decisions. So there are some remaining issues with accountability, even if we do have deputy ministers that it can be called before the House or before a committee. Even if we have ministers that are ultimately responsible, there's some issues about the accountability in the public service simply because the public service is a group of people who are unelected. Bureaucrats increasingly these days are worried about access to information requests, so they won't put things on paper anymore. So I was, warned when I showed up here at RMC that, my emails someday could be access to informationable. So somebody could request to see my emails because I am a public servant. So, does that make me think twice before I send a specific email and maybe want to pick up the phone and call somebody instead or talk to them in person? And that might actually cause some problems with accountability because there'll be less of a paper trail, knowing that anyone can, a journalist or the public can request access to any sort of files because of access to information. Other issues with accountability, government is really complex, and especially with the number of programs and services that are being offered by the government, it's very hard to tell who has responsibility, especially when ministries are working together on projects, which is really what this whole of government approach is. You've probably heard of that. But essentially this idea that ministries need to be working together to solve complex problems, but then the tricky thing is, well, who's ultimately responsible and who's ultimately in charge? The question of, who does the bureaucracy represent? They're unelected, so, are they supposed to be representing certain policy communities? Are they supposed to be, working for the government? There's some questions about, who are they accountable to? The non-departmental sector is the idea, so those are things like departments, or not departments, offices and agencies that aren't strictly underneath a specific department. So crown corporations, agencies like, say, Elections Canada, for example, where it's a little trickier to know exactly where they lie in the public service and who is really accountable if they don't have directly a minister in charge. Some say that there's a growing politicization of the public service, that it's really tricky to get nonpartisan advice, especially if ministerial staff is being moved from office to office and aren't necessarily working in one ministry for their whole career. So that leads to the next issue with accountability, is this idea that that the flow of information and knowledge of past departmental activity is really important, especially if ministers are coming and going. So if the individuals in a ministry are also starting to move around, so the idea that, I can get a better job in this ministry, I can move up the ladder by going to another ministry, then, who can really speak truth to power if nobody has that institutional knowledge? And so that's another issue regarding the accountability of the public service. So another comic. So why is this funny or poignant? So this idea, the assistant director of the commission to advise the committee on government streamlining, the idea of a ballooning public service, or the idea that there's just so many people involved now, it's so complex that who's really in charge and who's really accountable for the decisions that are going on. So we're going to shift focus now to public policy. So that's one of the main role of the bureaucracy, is to implement the public policy. So where does public policy come from? So I'm going to go through some of the kind of traditional ways that we understand public policy, and then you'll get a chance in your seminar to look at some case studies. So there is evidence that there is policy capacity in the public service. Even today, the public service has influence over the content and ordering of items on the public agenda, specifically what kind of things make it onto the agenda. And so policymaking is now increasingly horizontal. The idea is that they'll work with other departments, and they'll also work with other sorts of outside players like interest groups. So where then are departments getting their policy direction? It depends. Oftentimes the prime minister, ministers themselves, interest groups, their own departmental agenda. And generally, though, these decisions relating to policy, especially on the big items, will be coordinated at the center. So we saw the centralization of prime ministerial power, and we know that a lot of key public policy decisions are being decided at the center. So there's three key elements to building a public policy. The first is a definition of a problem. The second is figuring out what kind of goals you want to achieve, and then finding certain instruments or means to address those problems. So let's look more specifically now at the policy cycle, or how we see public policy being developed. So we like to see it as a cycle in 5 different steps. So let's go through each of these steps in context. Okay, so the first step is what we call agenda setting. So the idea is that you're going to recognize that there's some problem that exists. So for example, we notice that the cadets are way too thin and they are not eating enough food. All right. And so the key actors involved there would be everybody who has an idea or interest. So it would be the training wing, it would be RMC hierarchy, it would be the cadets themselves, it would be the Minister of National Defense, it would be, the Food Services Lobby Group, it would be, maybe even people from finance. So there's a variety of different people who will be involved in agenda setting and saying, hey, we've noticed this problem, we've noticed that the cadets aren't eating enough. What do we do about it? And so oftentimes that can come from within. So the prime minister might say, you know what, this is going to be a great election platform, feed the cadets. And so they put that forward, and so that's how the agenda is set. Or it could be, cadets rising up and saying, we need more food. And so it can happen in a variety of ways, and a variety of people can be involved in that. The next step is what we call policy formation. So there is a proposal of a solution. So maybe we think of the solutions. One solution could be, we need to get more food at the mess. Or maybe we need to increase their pay raises, or maybe we need to install kitchens in the barracks, or something like that. And so this is a smaller group of people who have knowledge in the area will propose a variety of solutions to the problem. The third stage is the decision making. So where you choose a solution, and generally it'll be government decision makers. So depending on the level of the policy, it could be the minister and the prime minister and the party deciding on it, or if it's something more technical, then it could be other people within the department kind of making decisions and then reporting back to the minister on it. So let's say in this case we decide that we need to install kitchens in the barracks because the cadets get hungry when the mess is closed. Okay. Step 4 is to implement it. So you put that solution into effect. You again are working with those who have knowledge of the area. So you have the cadets, you have training wing, you have the people from plant and facilities on the base who are have to give everybody fire extinguishers because now they have kitchens. So you really have to implement it. And then the final step is to evaluate it. So what was the result? Did the cadets eat more food? Maybe you find actually no, because none of them know how to cook. So generally that might have been the wrong solution to the problem. Maybe the solution needs to be sending more healthy choices to the mess, or giving them a pay raise so they can eat out more. So whatever the solution happens to be, you really need to evaluate it after it's been influenced. Unfortunately, sometimes things are not evaluated afterwards, and you end up with policies and programs that are in place just because they've always been in place. So that you really see public policy then as a cycle, that once you evaluate a policy and say, hey, this isn't really working, then you're going to start the process all over again. So, maybe the issue wasn't necessarily that the cadets were hungry, but that the food was really bad and they didn't want to eat it. So maybe what we did, in the agenda setting was kind of not the right track to take. And so that then this whole cycle will start again after you've evaluated the policy. So that's the idea of how policy is made. Obviously in practice, it's a little more complex, and you're going to get to look at one case of that in the seminar class. So that's what we have for today on public policy and public administration. So head on over to the quiz, take a look at that and do the quiz before the next class, and we'll see you in class.